Good. Okay. That's you good? Flights? Hi. So thanks for coming to this semester's first event in the Cognitive Science and in the Arts and Humanities speaker series. Our next event, to really quickly plug that, is April 6th. Dr. Aniska Kuzmakova from Stockholm University is going to give a talk and host a seminar that afternoon. If you're in the English department, it's the same day, I believe, as the Salon, so they won't overlap, so hopefully you can just come out and make a day of it. Today's speaker is Dr. Margaret Freeman, who in the last couple of days I've found to be as generous as she is accomplished. She retired in 2002 from Los Angeles Valley College in California after more than 30 years of teaching in the humanities. Earlier in her career, she taught right here on Long Island at SUNY Old Westbury, back when it was just a regular haven of liberal education. They didn't have grades for their courses, which is awesome. Since retiring, she is now the co-director of the Merrifield Institute for Cognition and the Arts in Heath, Massachusetts. The Merrifield Institute promotes collaboration among researchers engaged in exploring the role of the arts in the development of human cognition. They host scholars and artists pursuing such research in a secluded setting, aimed at promoting discussion of issues, problems, and future directions. They also maintain a research library of materials in the cognitive sciences and arts. Her research interests lie in the interdisciplinary fields of the cognitive sciences, especially literature, poetics, linguistics, and philosophy. Her publications are far too many to count, but her most recent work can be found in Poetics Today, Cognitive Semiotics, Cognition, Communication, and Discourse, the Routledge Handbook of Stylistics, Emily Dickinson in Context, the Emily Dickinson Journal, New Directions in Emily Dickinson Studies, there's a theme, Cognitive Literary Studies, Current Themes and New Directions, and Toward a Theory of Cognitive Poetics. She's also co-editing a new series from Oxford University Press on cognition and poetics, and the initial publication, coming in May 2016, is titled Cognitive Approaches to Early Modern Spanish Literature. She is currently working in cognitive aesthetics with a particular focus on developing a theory of poetic iconicity, which she'll be discussing today. Her talk is called Another Way to See, Iconicity in Emily Dickinson's Fascicle 16. There are such fascicles on that back table, so please grab one if you haven't already. And please welcome Dr. Margaret Freeman.
Thank you, Dan. That was a very generous introduction. Well, I thank the Cognitive Sciences and the Arts and Humanities and the English department for inviting me to share with you my current work on poetic iconicity and poetry. And I hope you all have a copy of the Fascicle 16 that I'll be talking about. The new series that we have in Cognition and Poetics from Oxford University Press, there is a flyer on the back for the first book in the first volume in the series, which you're welcome to pick up. My presentation today falls into two parts: a brief discussion of poetic iconicity, followed by an exploration of how iconicity might be working in Emily Dickinson's Fascicle 16. This is very much a work in progress, so I look forward to any comments or suggestions you might have. Let's see, let me start. Iconicity is understood in different ways in semiotics, linguistics, popular discourse, and religion. My theory of poetic iconicity draws from all four approaches. In semiotics, all images are icons. According to Charles Sanders Peirce, an icon is structurally complex, made up of metaphor, image, and diagram. Although these are understood as subcomponents of the icon, my interpretation is different. Instead of seeing them as separate examples of an icon, following Falconier and Turner's blending theory, I see metaphor as the component of a generative space that enables the blending or fusion of diagram or structure and image or concept into the poetic icon. So, for example, the dominant structuring metaphor of Dickinson's Fascicle 16, as we will see, is knowing is seeing. In linguistics, focus is placed on the attributes of mappings between structure and concept, so that the words enact what they say. As you can see from the chart, these attributes are manifold and complex. They can be sensory images or diagrammatic in form. Poetry is exemplary in exploiting iconic features across all of these dimensions. I find it significant that Nanny and Fisher place metaphor at the same level as isomorphism and iconicity, because these are crucial elements in poetic iconic function. In popular discourse, the term iconic is currently so widely used that it has become practically bleached of meaning. Anything that is meaningful to an individual or group is considered iconic. However, it retains the important underlying metaphorical sense of connecting an artifact, event, or other feature with something else, as in the Miami Tower example. As the architect noted in his introduction of his hairpin tower, quote, "I can hold up a handful of architectural icons from throughout the world, and you would identify the city in a heartbeat. Miami is on the precipice of becoming a world-class city, and one of the goals is an iconic structure." Note that two elements exist in Berkowitz's statement. Identity between the tower and the city is immediately recognized, not by the mind, but with the sensory emotional reference to a heartbeat, and that creating an iconic structure is an intentional goal. When art is successful, it becomes iconic. Popular understanding therefore does two things important for poetic iconicity. It establishes the affective aspect of the icon and introduces the notions of motivation and intention. In religion, an icon is ontologically connects the material with the spiritual. Catholics have long argued with Protestants over whether the bread and the wine in the communion service is transformed into or simply a symbolic representation of the body and blood of Christ. From an iconic perspective, neither is true. When the priest says, echoing Christ's words at the Last Supper, quote, "This is my body which is given for you, this is my blood which is shed for you," the bread and the wine become icons of God's presence in the bread and the wine, through which communicants might share in Christ's suffering and become united in God's love. What the religious usage of icon contributes to the theory of poetic iconicity is thus the idea of what an icon does in being able in some way to access and emotionally identify with the immaterial and the spiritual. Iconicity, then, is the motivating force for poetic creation and response. This is a rough model of the poem as icon. The semiotic space represents the natural, social, and cultural worlds of our experience. The sensory emotional layers of our pre-conscious understanding motivate and inform the structure and concepts of the arts. Metaphor maps across these domains to connect the physical with the immaterial to create the icon. When the poem becomes an icon of reality, it creates sensations, feelings, and images in language that enable both creator and respondent to encounter them as phenomenally present and real in our experienced world. If you ask poets, what is poetry? They will invariably answer with what a poet does, knowing that a list of features can never define a poem. Joseph Conrad's words in his introduction to the Nigger of the Narcissus sum up what poets do. And this whole excerpt that I'm going to read to you, I couldn't highlight anything because it's all highlighted. It's just incredible. It's just wonderful. This is what he says. "A work that aspires, however humbly, to the condition of art should carry its justification in every line. And art itself may be defined as a single-minded attempt to render the highest kind of justice to the visible universe by bringing to light the truth, manifold and one, underlying its every aspect. It is an attempt to find in its forms, in its colors, in its light, in its shadows, in the aspects of matter and in the facts of life, what of each is fundamental, what is enduring and essential, their one illuminating and convincing quality, the very truth of their existence. My task, which I am trying to achieve, is, by the power of the written word, to make you hear, to make you feel. It is, before all, to make you see. That and no more, and it is everything." It is what poetry does that is important, not what it means. It breaks down the barrier between our conceptions and the physical world of reality. When I was a teaching assistant at UMass half a century ago, I read for Leo Marx at Amherst College, and what reading meant, for those of you who don't know that expression, it means I graded the papers for his students. He had 120 students in his American literature class every semester. Anyway, in his class in American literature, Marx drew this sketch on the blackboard to explain Emersonian transcendence. We cannot perceive reality directly. The poetic eye enables us to break through the barrier that separates appearance from reality by transcending it to create through language a semblance or icon of reality. The term transcend means to go across. In Marx's diagram, that crossing of the barrier, if you notice, ascends by going up and over to access reality, the transparent eyeball of his essays. Emersonian transcendence reflects a positive approach to life, but reality is not simply sweetness and light. Reality also has, Reality also has a flip side that reveals the dark night of the soul. In this case, transcendence occurs through descent, going downward and under. To be iconic of reality, poetry must embrace both. This reality is not the reality that arises from our conceptualized representations of the world, but the reality of our being part of what Maurice Merleau-Ponty calls the invisible world, the immediate, always fleeting present that forever escapes our objectivizing gaze. Poetry restores us to the primordial, pre-categorial experience of being part of the structure of reality. Iconicity is thus the motivating force for poetry in its attempt to capture the subliminal nature of our sensory emotional experience of the pre-categorial world. John Burnside captures that pre-categorial world in his definition of Paul Eluard's L'autre monde. That non-factual truth of being, the missed world, and by extension, the missed self, who sees and imagines, not by some rational process, but by a kind of radical illumination. Or, as Wallace Stevens expresses it, the sense that we can touch and feel a solid reality which does not wholly dissolve itself into the conceptions of our own minds. Poetry, then, constitutes the immaterial, sensory, emotional feelings we experience through its material forms. In the presence of a poem, we experience its presentness of a reality that comes alive for us, that animates, in Coleridge's words, the whole soul of man into activity. As we read the poem, if we are successful in incorporating, taking its body into ours, our embodied simulation of its identity will make the poem iconic of our own reality. That brings me to the second part of my talk, how Dickinson's poetry achieves the poetic insight of our felt reality. When we read a poem, either silently or aloud, we are enacting the poem. In doing so, we are taking on the perspective of the voice of the poem, either overtly through a speaker or implied. We are going to look at a group of poems assembled by Emily Dickinson because we tend to read a poem in isolation. Rarely do we see a poem in the context in which the poet has placed it for publication, whether in a particular magazine or collected together with other poems in a book. This is especially true for the poems of Emily Dickinson that were not published during her lifetime. And when we read a Dickinson poem, it will almost invariably be one that appears in an edited version. Although the later editions of her poems attempt to reproduce as accurately as possible Dickinson's own words and markings, they nevertheless involve editorial decisions over such matters as alternate wording, line breaks, capitalization, various markings, usually referred to as dashes, and even variant existing copies. Reading editions of her poems are selective in nature, with the editors forced to choose only one possibility out of several variants or one version of a poem that exists in different forms in several manuscript copies. Reading a Dickinson poem in its manuscript form provides a very different embodied, enacted, and emotional experience from its printed version that makes the fascicle as a whole an icon of experienced reality. Although Dickinson did not publish her poems in print for public distribution, she did compile editions of many of her poems in 40 bound and hand-sewn booklets. Mabel Loomis Todd, one of her first editors, called them fascicles, and that's the name that has stuck. Reading a poem under the context of other poems in a fascicle provides yet another kind of embodied, embedded, extended, enacted, and emotional experience. So today, what I'd like to do is share with you one of those booklets, Fascicle 16. I have given you a replica of the fascicle, exactly as Dickinson assembled it, with only one difference. I have not reproduced her actual manuscript for each poem, but rather chosen a handwriting font that is more legible. All the crossings out and the misspellings are hers. Because it is important to experience the 11 poems as a whole read out loud, before looking more closely at their poetic effects, I asked members of our Institute's Emily Dickinson Reading Circle to read the fascicle for us. As they read aloud each poem, you will see an image of its actual manuscript on the screen. The fascicle as a whole represents poetic discourse as a journey narrative that reflects the nature of poetic seeing. As you listen to the readings, I hope you will follow and note recurrent elements in the poems that upend conventional seeing. Okay, now, this is where I'm not sure. How do I hit?
Just go over and click the little sound button.
You'll have to come, David. I'm sorry. I forgot to ask you how I did that.
As I could take between my finite eyes the motions of the dipping birds, the morning's amber road, for mine to look at when I liked, the news would strike me dead. So safer, guess, with just my soul upon the window pane, where other creatures put their eyes, incautious of the sun.
Oh, did I go too far? Yeah. Sorry. I'm not good at doing this. Go back. I need to go back one. You better stand up here, David.
No problem. Would you like to play?
We just did that one. Can we go to the next slide? That's it. Good. Thank you.
Of nearness to her sundered things, the soul has special times, when dimness looks the oddity, distinctness easy seems. The shapes we buried dwell about, familiar in the rooms, untarnished by the sepulchre. The moldering playmate comes in just the jacket that he wore, long buttoned in the mold, since we, old mornings, children played, divided by a world. The grave yields back her robberies, the years our pilfered things, bright knots of apparitions salute us with their wings, as we it were that perished, themself had just remained till we rejoined them, and 'twas they and not ourself that mourned.
I'm so mechanically in there.
Tie the strings to my life, my lord. Then I am ready to go. Just to look at the horses, rapid, that will do. Put me in on the firmest side, so I shall never fail. For we must ride to the judgment, and it's partly downhill. But never I mind the steepest, and never I mind the sea, held fast in everlasting race by my own choice and thee. Goodbye to the life I used to live and the world I used to know, and kiss the hills for me just once. Then I am ready to go.
I like a look of agony because I know it's true. Men do not sham convulsion nor simulate a throe. The eyes glaze once and that is death, impossible to feign. The beads upon the forehead, by homely anguish strung.
I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and down, and hit a whirl at every plunge, and finished knowing then.
"'Tis so appalling, it exhilarates, so over horror, it half captivates. The soul stares after it, secure. To know the worst leaves no dread more. To scan a ghost is faint, but grappling conquers it. How easy torment now, suspense kept sawing so. The truth is bald and cold, but that will hold. If any are not sure, we show them prayer. But we who know, stop hoping now. Looking at death is dying. Just let go the breath, and not the pillow at your cheek, so slumbereth. Others can wrestle, yours is done. And so of woe, bleak dreaded, come. It sets the fright at liberty, and terrors free, gay, ghastly holiday.
How noteless men in Pleiad stand, until a sudden sky reveals the fact that one is wrapped forever from the eye. Members of the invisible, existing while we stare, in leafless opportunity, or takeless as the air. Why didn't we detain them, the heavens with a smile, sweep by our disappointed heads without a syllable?
When we stand on the tops of things and like the trees look down, the smoke all cleared away from it, and mirrors on the scene just laying light, no soul will wink except it have the flaw. And sound ones like the hill shall stand. No lightning scares away. The perfect nowhere be afraid. They bear their dauntless heads where others dare not go at noon, protected by their deeds. The stars dare shine occasionally upon a spotted world, and suns go surer for their proof, as if an axle held.
"'Twas just this time last year I died. I know I heard the corn. When I was carried by the farms, it had the tassels on. I thought how yellow it would look when Richard went to mill, and then I wanted to get out, but something held my will. I thought just how red apples wedged the stubble's joints between, and carts went stooping round the fields to take the pumpkins in. I wondered which would miss me least, and when Thanksgiving came, if father'd multiply the plates to make an even sum. And would it blur the Christmas glee, my stocking hang too high for any Santa Claus to reach the altitude of me? But this thought grieved myself, and so I thought the other way, how just this time some perfect year themself should come to me.
Afraid. Of whom am I afraid? Not death, for who is he? The porter of my father's lodge as much abasheth me. Of life? 'Twere odd I fear a thing that comprehendeth me in one or two existences, just as the case may be. Of resurrection? Is the East afraid to trust the morn with her fastidious forehead? As soon impeach my crown.
He showed me heights I never saw. Wouldst climb, he said? I said, not so. With me, he said, with me? He showed me secrets, morning's nest, the rope the nights were put across, and now wouldst have me for a guest? I could not find my yes. And then he brake his life, and lo, a light for me did solemn glow, the larger as my face withdrew. And could I further know?
The fascicle turns out to have an interesting structure. On the left, you can see that the first and last poems frame the entire group, with the poem in the center, "'Tis so appalling," dividing the poems equally above and below. On the right, each poem above links to one below. Although images occur repeatedly throughout the poems, nevertheless, the linked poems stand in particular relationship to each other, talking to and answering each other across the divide of the central poem. The poems read in order present poetic discourse as a linear journey narrative that explores the heights and depths of human experience. The fascicle schema is one of verticality. As the first 5 poems proceed, the movement is metaphorically down to culminate in the lowest depths of experience in the central poem. The last 5 poems reverse this movement to become metaphorically up. However, the story is not that simple. Whereas in conventional thinking, up is good and down is bad, poetic experience contains the tensions and resolutions, the ups and downs of a life of feeling. The power of Dickinson's poetry, then, is one that reverses attitudes, perceptions, and assumptions to break through the conventional to an awareness of our being as part of the natural and spiritual worlds. It would take an entire volume to explore all the metaphorical images, semantic networks, structural patternings, and the emotional weight of prosodic elements that create the fascicle as iconic of our sensory emotional experience. So instead, I will focus on just 2 aspects: the metaphor of knowing is seeing that structures the fascicle, and the verticality schema that underlies it. You can follow my brief sketch of each poem by referring to your fascicle replica. The opening poem, "Before I Got My Eye Put Out," sets out the topic and theme of the fascicle, poetry as spiritual insight. It introduces the conventional metaphor of knowing is seeing, but transforms it. To see is to know, but how we see affects what we know. The first and last stanzas provide an outer frame for the 3 interior stanzas that describe the emotional power of belonging to the world. As creatures that have eyes, we take the natural world for granted as we move through life. Conventional seeing leads to knowledge of the world that is limited. No explicit reason is given for how or why the speaker's eye got put out. However, the final line of the poem invokes the idea that staring at the sun, as some Californian hippies in the 70s and 80s found to their cost, can make you blind. The sun, as a metaphor for God, invokes the biblical notion that you see God and die. Notice how the 3 middle stanzas are not describing the natural world as those that have eyes that see it, but rather describing it as a report to the poem's eye whose eye got put out. By imagining the world as one that can be owned and possessed, the speaker responds emotionally. The heart would split. The plenitude of sight is awarded to finite eyes. And finally, the news that looking at the world would strike one dead. Although this idiomatic usage of being struck dead is not customarily meant literally, here it introduces the notion of physical death, which reverberates throughout the fascicle. Safer then to see the soul with the soul instead of with the eye. What is this knowing that this other way to see presents? Conventionally, we think of life and death as two separate and irreconcilable states. In Of Nearness to Her Sundered Things, the soul as poetic insight makes distinct the nearness of those who have died in a unification of life and death. The focus on burial and graves enacts a movement down from the life above, at the same time that the dead themselves appear as ghostly apparitions up in the sky. In the opening stanza, the dimness, obscurity, is ascribed to normal seeing, the distinctness, clarity, to the soul's insight. This contrast becomes the reversal in the last stanza. In this stanza, the speaker crosses the boundary between life and death in what would otherwise be seen as a counterfactual impossibility, that it is the dead and not the living who remain and mourn. Note that the stanza is a mirror image of the last stanza in the the last stanza of "'Twas just this time last year I died," which is later in the fascicle, with the difference that the earlier poem is told from the perspective of the living, the later from the perspective of the dead. That poetic knowledge leads to an understanding and acceptance of death in Time's String to My Life. The poem begins the living's journey toward death, with the verticality schema now emerging more clearly in the middle stanzas, with fall downhill and steepest. The firmest side refers to the side of a horse carriage that secures its passengers from the dangers of falling out when the horses are racing downhill. It is no accident that our reader of this poem unconsciously substituted the word fail for fall. The look of the first stanza, as the speaker prepares for the journey to death, becomes a foreshadowing of leaving the world of conventional knowledge in the last. The inversion of conventional attitudes. In I Like a Look of Agony, images of looking and knowing exist in parallel with the images of agony, convulsion, throe and death and anguish, as the arrows suggest. You can see how look, know, eyes, and then on this side you've got agony, throe, death and anguish. The themes of sight and death and truth coalesce as the poem opposes conventional attitudes by invoking the truth of pain and suffering. Life's strings in the previous poem have become the beads of anguish strung on the forehead, as the truth of poetic seeing embraces the pains as well as the joys of life. This deservedly famous poem, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, that concludes the first part of the fascicle, captures all the earlier themes as it narrates the interior journey downward in the form of funeral service. The breaking through of all normal sense and reason is complete, as both speaker and poem plunge down and down to rock bottom. Focus is on the subliminal, sensory, emotional feelings triggered by the funeral's progress that is another way of seeing. This other way of seeing helps us understand the final line, and finished, or as I prefer it, got through, which is one of the variants, got through knowing, is as another crossing of the boundary. Does it denote the end or the beginning of knowledge? The then that is set off by dashes is both backward, looking into the conventional assumption that our world knowledge dies in death, in other words, and finished knowing then, and forward into the different kind of knowing that unites death and life, in other words, and got through knowing then. Stasis, the freedom of true knowledge. Into so appalling it exhilarates, we have reached the nadir of experience, when by seeing and knowing the worst, the soul is no longer afraid. The images and themes that occur throughout the poems are present here. It is no longer the eyes, but the soul who stares, sees. We are no longer separated from being part of the world of both life and death, as observers who know no other way of seeing, but accept the bold and cold truth in the security of knowing that looking at death is dying, setting fright and terror free. The last line sums up the inversion of conventional attitudes in the oxymoronic idea of holiday as both gay and ghastly. Note that the sound repetitions of the vowels A, R in gay, ghastly, repeat in chiasmic reverse, R, A in holiday. Movement up, the rapture of the dead. After this central poem, the focus in the rest of the fascicle is going to be up. How noteless men and Pleiades stand shifts from down to up. Dickinson would have known that Galileo, the first to view the Pleiades through a telescope, discovered that the cluster of stars contains stars too dim to be seen with the naked eye. It is therefore a fitting analogy to the dead who exist, although they're invisible. Reference to sky, air, and heavens forces us to look upward as we stare. The rhyming of sky and eye bring the two images together so that what the eye has not noticed or paid attention to is revealed only when it vanishes. The lexical suffix less has the effect of making absent what it modifies. Note less, league less, or take less. Its repetitions reinforce the notion of what is taken away. Our failure to see that the dead still exist though invisible, is the cause of our disappointment. This poem thus links to the earlier poem of nearness to her sundered things that, as we saw, enables the soul to see the dead, the mouldering playmate who appears to the soul's insight. The zenith of human experience. In when we stand on the tops of things, the verticality of perspective is established as the ability to see clearly from spiritual and poetic heights. The poem talks to and answers the earlier poem, I like a look of agony because I know it's true. The obscurity of conventional seeing is cleared away with the perfection of the soul, who no longer is afraid. Are we of the first stanza up here, when we stand, dead or alive? Again, there is the interchangeability of the dead and the living in the crossing of boundaries. The poem opens, as a reader anyway, for me, with the assumption that it is the living who stand and look. But the second stanza, it is only the soul who can see clearly without winking, that is flawless. We end with the notion that it is the perfect who are not afraid, are fearless. The idea that the perfected life is not possible in the flawed and spotted world of our conventional experience. The perfected soul that has become the subject and agent of this fascicle is what poetic seeing achieves. The perspective from death. The poem "'Twas Just This Time Last Year I Died" reverses the point of view of the living contemplating death we saw in I Felt a Funeral in My Brain to the dead contemplating life. From this perspective, the dead have achieved the height of altitude far above the spotted world of the previous poem. We have already seen the mirror image of the poem's last stanza in Of Nearness to Her Sundered Things, and I've repeated it here. Here it is the dead persona who thinks the other way. The triumph of poetic insight. Death, life, and resurrection, the three great themes of human experience. The three great themes of human existence, I should say, are finally brought together in the triumph of poetic perception. The poem is a vindication of the central poem's nadir and its corollary in the security of a soul that, knowing the worst, fears no dread more. It parallels the triumphant acceptance of the journey to death we saw in Tie the Strings to My Life, My Lord. The one or two or more existences again reinforces the notion that there is no distinction between life and death. They are as one. Achieving spiritual and poetic commitment. The last poem in the fascicle, He Showed Me Heights I Never Saw, is presented on the left. It portrays the process introduced in the very first poem, before I got my eye put out, of the other way of seeing, as the speaker is shown what was never seen. The speaker moves from denial, not so, to recognizing that a yes is not yet found, to the final statement, could I further? No. Even if not explicitly stated, this affirmation of acceptance, reinforced by the placing of no in quotes and a line of its own, plays on the sound pun of the no of negation and the no of knowledge. The suggestion of Christ's offer to the soul and his sacrifice to save it implies in the last stanza that the light is a spiritual one. On the right is another version of the poem that Dickinson sent to her sister-in-law, Sue, that reverses the pronouns, with the result that both poems exist from the perspectives of both receiving and providing spiritual and poetic commitment. Here it is the poet who has become the agent of showing the respondent another way to see. Giving us another way to see, changing the pronouns once again shows us another way to see both the poem and the fascicle as a whole. If she is the poet and we are the audience, we have been drawn into the sensory, emotional, embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended experience of seeing the world both as material and spiritual, not as separate from us, but ourselves as identified with it. And let me read the poem. She showed us heights we never saw. Wouldst climb, she said. We said, not so. With me, she said, with me. She showed us secrets, morning's nest, the ropes the nights were put across. And now, wouldst have me for a guest? We could not find our yes. And then she brake her life, and lo, a light for us did solemn glow, the steadier as our face withdrew. And could we further? No. I'd like to thank the members of the Emily Dickinson Reading Circle at Mirrorfield Institute for their illuminating discussions of Fascicle 16. Our readers were Sandra Dennis, Esther Haskell, Jenna Holtzman, Polly Longsworth, Greg Mattingly, Margaret McBride, Jeff Morgan, Alice Parker, Mary Claire Powell, and with special thanks to Leslie Clark for technical expertise, editing, and helping me bind the fascicles. Thanks to you for your participation.
Thank you. That was great. We have some time to open up for questions.
Can I change my glasses? I can't see with my reading glasses on.
Well, I'd love to hear, it was so wonderful and rich, and so many things are trying to make sense of it. But you had this lovely sentence about the fascicle as a whole, as an iconic experiential reality. And so, having gone through it, and I think things are sort of chunking into place, but I'm just wondering if, after hearing all that, you could just say a little bit more about how you see that operating.
Yeah, I know. That's why it's a work in progress, Emmy. I still have not formulated sufficiently clearly in my own mind, because I like to do it in one or two sentences, what poetic iconicity is. And for a lot of my earlier publications, I use Suzanne Langer's statement in her theory of art, that art is the semblance of felt life through forms symbolic of human feeling. And I say poetic iconicity is the means by which that happens. But I've decided I don't like that after having done that, because forms symbolic of human feeling isn't quite what I'm saying, because it's really forms iconic of human feeling, not symbolic, which is a different matter. So I'm still struggling. I'm still struggling to decide how iconicity is really working. But I think, I hope that the experience that I've just taken all of you through, that we went through in our discussion in our reading circle, sort of helps us to feel or have access to those sensory emotional feelings that are not conscious. I think the poet is articulating them, and I think that's what art does. I think art enables us to have a sense that our conceptualizing reason of conventional thinking is blocking us, in Leo Marx's image, blocking us from really understanding that we really are part of the world. We tend to think of ourselves as separate from the world, especially in the Western tradition with the mind-body split of Cartesian perception, right? That we are observers of a world that's out there. And yet we're not, we're part of it. I mean, the Heisenberg principle in the 20th century really helped us to begin to see that that's not true. that we change what we see, and we see what we change, if you like, in a way. So I don't know whether I'm answering your question fully, but I can't.
No, that's okay. So, but would you say that when you talk about the Fascicle as a whole as an icon, are you talking about the physical structure of this as well as our travel,
absolutely,
as well as the conceptual moves we're making up and back down, imagining it, and going into the middle and then coming back out again. It's all of that. That is what all of those things are iconic and facilitating a more comprehensive experience of a almost what's that beautiful word? Inexpressible truth about the sort of death, life,
relationship
that she's talking about.
You said it better than I could. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
It is the material. I have a paper that I wrote a long time ago called "The Body in the Word," where I argue that a lot of people, a lot of poems have been misread by critics and by the editors because they have not seen the material aspect of the manuscript, so that line breaks become really important in Dickinson. There were 2 examples I did in that particular paper that showed that by regularizing the lines, they had changed the syntax in such a way that they misread the poem. And, so that it becomes very important to do that, it seems to me. I mean, it's as though you looked at a picture of a piece of art rather than seeing the original. You've got to see the original. You've got to see those paintbrushes and those lines and everything that the artist has done to be able to get that experience. And of course, with poetry, you only have black marks on the page, but it's the sound also in your head, which is why I thought it was important for you to hear these poems read aloud. Yeah. David?
Not a question, but some further experiential evidence for you, I guess. When we were reading it, I mean, of course, I'm familiar with some of these poems, but I marked the middle poem without realizing that it was the middle one. So
That's nice, David. Thank you. Thank you for that confirmation. Because I think it's a question of intuition, But Benedetto Croce, the Italian philosopher, has a beautiful, and I'm terrible at quoting things, but I'll try, has a beautiful comment about intuition, that it isn't, he says that we think we see a smile. I'm seeing some of you smiling. I see Peter smiling at the back. We think we see a smile. But we don't really see a smile until we have, and think of Leonardo da Vinci, painting it on the canvas, actually making the smile. And the painter sees the smile in a way that we tend not to do it because we're, conceptualizing, thinking, why is he smiling, that kind of thing. So that I think that is also what art is doing, It is a question of intuition, immediate response that we have to art, and music and dance and poetry, all the arts, than we do for just regular communication and things like that. Peter.
This is a very small thing, but the poem that struck me the most was of nearness to her sundered things.
Yeah.
And then in the last paragraph, or the last stanza of that poem, as we were the parish themselves, and after an expense bring break marking papers, right? is the real solecism. And yet it is exactly the example that you amplify at the end about the barrier that goes is between plural and single.
That's right. That's right.
So that as you move your way through the text, you understand exactly why.
That's right. Why it's plural they and single self. Absolutely. I have a paper that I wrote many years ago called Grounded Spaces, and what I was talking about was how people have assumed that Dickinson didn't know her grammar. You get a lot of criticism like that. She did. She knew. She had her grammar, And so the question was, how does she use the self-pronoun throughout her poetry? And what I discovered was that she uses it as in mapping, in blending theory. If any of you are familiar with what I'm talking about with cognitive mapping and blending theory. But anyway, she has a poem that begins, I have a bird in spring that doth by self that for myself doth sing. Now, for us, that would be, I have a bird in spring that sings for me. So why is she using myself? Well, my argument is that whenever she crosses a space, and she's crossing spaces there, because when she says I have a bird in spring, she's writing in winter. She's mapping into the future, you know, that for myself doth sing. Now, when you are in your reality space. We are all in a reality space right now, together, present in the hall. But our imagination enables us to map to future, to past, to hypotheticals, to counterfactuals. You know, that's what the human imagination does. So when she says, I have a bird in spring, I is the reality space, where she is right now. She has the bird in spring, then for myself doth sing. She has moved herself into the spring to hear the bird, right? And when she does that, when she moves a person like them or him or her or I into another space, she'll use the self pronoun. And when she comes back to her reality space, she drops the self pronoun and she uses the regular in that kind of way. And that's perfectly consistent through her poems. Greg Mattingly was one of my readers, was very interested in that phenomenon because he read the paper. And so I challenged him. I said, he's a great reader of Dickinson. He's a guide at the museum as well. And I said, find me an exception. I want this, test this. I want this challenged, and so far we have not been able to. There are some poems where it looks as though there's a difference, but in fact it's because she's crossing those spaces backwards and forwards, in terms of how she uses that self-pronoun. But that's in addition to the point about the plural and the singular, which is beautiful, It really is.
I just wanted to toss out there's a great article or essay by Lakoff and about, he talks about the self.
That's right, yeah.
And he talks about, if I were Bridget Bardot, I'd kiss myself.
That was actually Jim McCawley's example.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's that same sort of thing when we're sort of casting ourselves.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. It was. If I dreamt that I was Bridget Bardot and I kissed me.
Oh, was I kissed me, not I kissed myself?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And that ruins my
Yeah.
example.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it was me, but I may be wrong. Could check.
So I have just kind of a basic or methodological question. Can you just say a bit about your thoughts on why a 4E, embodied, embedded,
Right.
That kind of approach versus a non-explicitly embodied approach, something like theory of mind? Why can't that give us this kind of reading? I agree that it can. I'm just
well, actually, I hadn't used those expressions until Amy put me on to 4E cognition. She wrote a proposal for a panel that we're going to hopefully offer in Irvine at a conference next December. And she used the term 4E cognition in her proposal. And I said, what the hell is 4E cognition? I had never heard of it, And then she told me and sent me to readings, that explained what 4E cognition was. And I realized that the embedded, enacted, and extended were really developments of what embodiment means. That when we talk about embodiment, what the hell does that mean? And Lakoff uses it, and Johnson uses it, but they never really open it up and unpack it. And I think that's what 4E cognition does. And I've changed it to 5E cognition by adding emotional, the 5 E's.
We can fight about that later.
Yeah, we can, yes. Name.
The last poem, the transition from the he to I to she. Can you comment on that a little bit more?
A little bit more. She has she does this several times, and not a lot, but she does do it. She has a poem that's oh God, now how does it go? Can't remember. It's about a letter that she's sending, and she addresses he. She uses the pronoun he. I sent her a letter. And then in another version of the poem, she says, I sent him a letter. So she's often crossing genders in that kind of way, which is kind of interesting too. I mean, elsewhere she does interesting things like that. So the fact that she's actually playing with the perspective of the agent and the patient and all the rest of things, I think is also an example that it isn't, you know, it's what does it do? It sort of creates we're both, you know, we're both agents and patients, right? And we can be either.
Saviors.
And yes, and saviors. And the fact that, you know, the question is, the poet is creating a poet, the artist is creating a work of art. What is the response to that? And it seems to me that a lot of literary critics and artistic critics and everything think about the reader or the observer or the listening to music in a kind of passive way, you know, that they're just taking it in, you know, it's like Locke's tabula rasa of the mind, right? But that's not true. What we're doing is we are creating the poem. The poem is just a piece of black and white marks on the page or on the screen, right? It is us who are enacting it as we read it, aloud or alive. So we are creating our own version of that poem, so that we ourselves are, you know, doing that. And so when she starts playing around with pronouns, it's playing around with all of those sorts of different ways that we participate and act in the world, I think.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.